My name is Dr. Thomas Webb. I am a doctor working across general medicine, longevity medicine, sports medicine. Recently, I've been helping doctors with their health, performance, longevity. And as someone would expect, I've learned a lot of things regarding medicine world that nobody finds out when they're simply studying it. So that's why today I wanted to make a video I genuinely wish somebody had made for me when I was 22 back in med school. I think medicine does a pretty good job at making sure you're clinically competent if you're willing to put the work in. It's about all the things that happen while you're becoming a doctor that nobody really warns you about. If I could sit across from my 22-year-old self over a coffee, I don't think the conversation would be about career advice. I wouldn't tell him what speciality to choose, for example. I wouldn't tell him where to work, and I wouldn't tell him how to earn more money. I'd probably start by asking him a very simple question. What kind of life are you actually trying to build for yourself? Because if I'm honest, I don't think I ever asked myself that question. And at 22, I had a very clear picture of the doctor I wanted to become. I wanted to be knowledgeable. I wanted to be respected amongst my colleagues. And I wanted patients to trust me. And I wanted to build a career that I was proud of. But I had almost no picture of the person I wanted to become outside of the hospital, or even how hard it is to maintain your sense of identity that you built up already at the age of 22, whether it is your fitness, your sport, running, etc., your habits outside of that identity of being a doctor. Because the big problem is medicine has a way of becoming the center of gravity in your life. And at first, that's completely understandable. You just step up as a junior doctor, foundation doctor, and you put all your energy into it. And here you're learning enormous amounts of information, you're adapting, and you're trying not to make mistakes. You're surrounded by people who seem more experienced than you as well, and you naturally throw yourself into it. The problem is that medicine rarely asks for a little bit of your attention. It has an extraordinary ability to ask for all of it. And at first, it's maybe your weekends because you're studying for your med school exams, or as a junior doctor, you're trying to learn the things you don't know. Or even just the IT systems in the hospital, for example. But then, if you let it can start taking away your physical health, your fitness, your hobbies outside of work. Because all these things start feeling optional and you just don't have the time or the energy for it. None of these decisions feel dramatic in isolation, and in fact, most of them feel responsible. If someone had looked back at me then, they probably would have said I was a dedicated doctor, learning my trade, disciplined, committed, putting my job first, and they would have been right. Because what nobody could see, including myself at the time, was that every time medicine expanded, something else quietly contracted. A little less time with friends, a little less movement, less time in the gym, less time running, even less time sleeping, and a little less space to simply exist as a human being outside of this identity of being a doctor. The difficult thing about this process is that it doesn't happen overnight, and it didn't for me. This can happen insidiously over time, gradually. It starts just feeling normal. You begin saying things like, I'll get back into training, into fitness, into prioritizing my health. Once this rotation finishes, once I feel comfortable as a doctor, or once I get to the next stage, once that exam is over, I'll call everyone once this exam is over, or I'll take a proper holiday next year. The strange thing is that medicine is full of next years. The goalposts are constantly moving. There's always another rotation around the corner, another thing to adapt to, another thing where you can just get better at, another promotion, another stage of responsibility. And if you're not careful, basically you can spend years waiting for life to finally calm down before you put attention into all these things you've neglected or have faded away. I remember a conversation I had with a doctor a few years ago. On paper, he was doing incredibly well in his career. He'd built this career, he'd wanted, respected by colleagues. He was earning a good income, and by most people's standards, he'd made it from the outside. But during our conversation, he said something that stayed with me ever since. He said, I honestly don't know what I enjoy anymore. Not because he was depressed, not because he hated the job of being a doctor. He'd simply spent so many years becoming an excellent doctor that he'd stopped investing in every other part of himself. If I had to tell you the uncomfortable truth, I recognized parts of myself in that conversation. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to make this video, because I don't think physician or doctor burnout always starts with exhaustion. I think it often starts much earlier than that. It starts the moment your entire identity becomes revolving around one thing, when your mood depends entirely on how work went that day, when every difficult shift follows you home, when your hobbies slowly disappear without you noticing it, and when you stop introducing yourself as someone who loves hiking, photography, traveling, sports, fitness, and you simply become the doctor, or, how your job is going, what rotation you're on. Because if medicine becomes your entire identity, every challenge inside medicine becomes deeply personal. A difficult patient isn't just a difficult patient. It feels like a reflection of who you are and your own self-esteem. A mistake doesn't just feel like a mistake. It feels like a judgment of your self-worth. And a bad week at work suddenly becomes a bad week in your life. And that's an incredibly heavy way to live. Looking back, I wish somebody told me that becoming a great doctor and becoming a healthy human being are two completely different projects that you have to prioritize. You can't focus solely on one and neglect the other. They are related, but they're not the same. Medicine teaches you how to care for other people. It doesn't always teach you how to protect yourself while you're doing it. And if there's one thing I've learned over the last several years, working not only with doctors, speaking to colleagues, and also as a doctor myself, but I've been fortunate to work in a longevity medicine company looking after the health of founders, executives, and other high performers, a lot of whom have built up this incredible amount of success, this net worth, this wealth by putting their career, their businesses first before their health. And often they get to the age of 40 wondering why they're overweight, why their bone density is low, why their bloods and cholesterol are high, and only then they start prioritizing arguably the most important thing that they've neglected. And they've done this because they've let work, achievements, career, business consume their life. They've put that first. And because for years I thought sacrifice was the answer to almost everything, and that probably is the lie that you're sold as a young 20-year-old something. If you just work harder, if you just contribute more to society, if you put other people first, then you're going to be successful, happy by the time you're 40. But that definitely isn't the case when you put your health, your fitness on the back burner. And that can be the really dangerous part. You can outwork poor habits for only so long, but over years, that is when it really breaks down and it's hard to get back. Eventually, biology catches up with all of us, and eventually the person you've neglected starts asking to be listened to. Even if you don't want to at first, you're going to feel more tired, you're going to have less energy, your health is going to start revealing itself. So that's where I'd have the first real conversation with my own 22-year-old self. I would discuss these challenges that are ahead of me. I'd tell him before he worries about becoming a better doctor, he needs to understand something far more fundamental. He needs to understand what actually keeps a human being performing well for 4 or 5 decades. Because once you understand that, you stop treating your health, your relationships, your other parts of your life as a secondary thing. You start prioritizing it and realizing it. That helps build the career. That helps you become a high performer and become a good doctor who enjoys your work, full of energy. One thing that took me embarrassingly long to understand was that I wasn't just becoming physically tired, I was becoming emotionally unavailable. But I don't think I would have used those words back then. If you'd asked me how I was doing, I probably would have said I was just busy working as a doctor, putting other things second and putting my job first. That was my answer for everything. I was busy. And maybe you've caught yourself saying the same thing. Friends ask how you're doing, busy. Family ask why you've disappeared, busy with work. You stop going to birthdays, you stop calling people back. You don't have the time, you don't have the energy. You start eating dinner while replying to emails because it feels productive. Everything becomes about efficiency. Looking back, I don't think I realized what I was actually giving up, because medicine slowly changes what normal looks like. The workload becomes normal. The amount of stress that you experience, the responsibility becomes normal. Missing social events becomes normal. And feeling emotionally flat, tired, drained as you go to bed becomes normal. Knowing you have to get up in 6 hours time for your next shift. And eventually you stop questioning it because everybody around you is doing the same thing. I remember speaking to one founder a few years ago who built an incredibly successful business. On paper he'd won, financially he was doing brilliantly, professionally he was doing brilliantly. But he said something that stayed with me since that conversation as well. He said, I've become incredibly good at building a business, but I honestly don't know if I've become any better at living. That sentence hit me hard because although he wasn't a doctor, he was clearly a very successful high performer. He was someone who'd put his business first for all these years. And medicine can become extremely good at teaching us how to function very well. It doesn't teach you how to feel alive, and there's an important difference. One thing researchers have consistently found when studying burnout is that emotional exhaustion isn't simply about working too many hours. It's about spending long periods of time giving emotional energy without replenishing it yourself. Think about what a normal week looks like. You're making difficult decisions, breaking bad news, supporting anxious families, managing uncertainty, and trying not to make mistakes. Trying to stay composed, trying to stay compassionate. And people often assume that because this isn't physically demanding, it somehow costs less. In reality, emotional regulation is one of the most metabolically demanding things your brain does. Every time you suppress frustration, every time you remain calm when you're internally stressed, every time you carry responsibility for someone else's well-being, your brain is working on overload. You don't notice it because there's no muscle soreness afterwards, but the cost does accumulate. The cost is real if you're carrying that stress around, if you're carrying those open loops around in your subconscious. Now here's where I think most doctors accidentally make things worse for themselves. They finish a demanding day believing they've recovered because they've stopped working. But stopping work isn't the same as recovering from work. There's an enormous difference. You can spend 4 hours scrolling through your phone after a shift and never actually recovering. You can watch Netflix all evening and never recover. You can lie in bed for 10 hours and never actually recover or feel refreshed. Because recovery isn't simply the absence of work. Recovery is the presence of things that restore the systems you've been using. That was probably the biggest mindset shift that I experienced. I stopped asking how do I rest, and I started asking what actually restores me. Those turned out to be completely different questions. For me, training, going to the gym, running restored me. Being outdoors restored me. Meaningful conversations restored me as well. Traveling did this. Doing difficult things that had absolutely nothing to do with medicine also restored me. I moved into a van, I traveled, and that became part of my journey. People often ask me why I lived in a van. They assume it was about a minimalism lifestyle or travel. Honestly, it wasn't. It was about interrupting the life I'd accidentally built for myself, which was very reactive, very much prioritizing one part of my life, my job, my identity of being a doctor. Wake up, work, study, sleep, repeat. Train if there was time, sleep if there was time. But in reality, I was neglecting my hobbies, my identities, things that restored me outside of medicine, outside of being a doctor. So I moved into the van, and the van forced me to remember that there was a world outside hospital walls. New places, new people, new challenges, and a new identity. Identity that I had for myself, that I valued, an identity of fitness, of health, of putting myself first. Was a very important reminder. I genuinely believe every doctor needs a reminder like that. Not necessarily moving into a van, but something that regularly reminds themselves that they're more than just their profession. Because here is the uncomfortable truth. If medicine becomes the only place you experience meaning, fulfillment, it also becomes the only place capable of taking meaning away from you. And that's a very dangerous position to be in. The doctors I've worked with personally who stay healthy for decades all seem to have one thing in common. They fiercely protect a part of themselves that has nothing to do with medicine. Some of them are runners, some of them are musicians even, and some of them are incredible parents which they prioritize. Some climb mountains and some build businesses. What matters is that they've built an identity that's bigger than just their job. And I wish I'd understood this in myself much earlier in my career. Because protecting your career and protecting yourself are not two separate goals. They're exactly the same goal, and that's why I had to look for an answer. because I realized I needed something that was simple enough to use when life became chaotic. Because the truth is, nobody starts analyzing neuroscience when they're overwhelmed. When you're exhausted after a difficult week, you're not opening research papers, you're just trying to make it through to Friday. So I came up with 5 questions that I still ask myself whenever I notice I'm not feeling like myself. They're not perfect, they're not scientific diagnostic tools, by no means, but they're simple questions that stop me from guessing. The first question is my body actually capable of supporting the life I'm asking for? That sounds like an obvious question until you genuinely sit with it, because for years I expected my body to perform at an incredibly high level while treating it like an afterthought. I'd expect sharp thinking after poor sleep, I'd expect stable emotions despite inconsistent training, and I'd expect resilience despite living almost entirely indoors or in hospital, eating hospital food that the canteen offers, or even skipping lunch. Looking back, it was actually quite irrational that I thought I could properly recover without looking after my body fully. One of the things medicine teaches is that physiology always wins eventually. You can't negotiate with biology. We know this from the patients that we look after. And the same happens to ourselves. If we don't proactively manage our energy or health, then we are eventually going to feel those consequences. So whenever I feel flat, I don't immediately assume something is psychologically wrong. I start with the obvious. How have I been sleeping? How have I been moving consistently? Have I been eating in a way that actually supports cognitive performance? Or have I just been grabbing whatever was easiest and most convenient between patients? Because your brain isn't separate from your body. It is part of your body. If you neglect one, eventually the other one notices. The second question I ask myself is, what has my attention been focusing on? Notice I didn't ask where my attention has been. I asked what it's been practicing. Because your brain is constantly adapting to the environment you expose it to. If every spare moment is spent checking your phone, jumping between emails, scrolling, social media, watching short form content, your brain slowly becomes incredibly good at task switching. And the same applies to the job itself. If you're constantly being used to high stress situations, met calls, responding to nurses, to patients, to colleagues, then again, you're going to be incredibly good at managing multiple tasks at once. So staying with one complex problem, one deep moment, one thing to focus on is a new skill in itself. Maybe even staying with your own thoughts. One thing that completely changed my own concentration wasn't finding some fancy productivity hack. It was deliberately giving my brain opportunities to practice focusing on one thing at one time. I'd read without checking my phone for 20 minutes. I'd write down one task to focus on and I'd do that task to completion. I'd put my phone in a different room. Obviously, you can't do this all the time when you're working or certain situations, but there's plenty of opportunity in your days or in your week where you can implement this. And just like fitness, attention comes back through training, not motivation, but actually practicing that skill. The third question is probably the one that catches me most often. What emotion have I been carrying around that I haven't acknowledged? Doctors become incredibly good at functioning, sometimes too good. You finish a difficult conversation with a patient's family, for example, you walk into the next room and your brain simply tells you to keep going. What's the next task? What's the next job to do? You basically process it just enough to continue working. Then you drive home as though nothing happened. You almost forget about it, but it still is there in the background in your subconscious. Eventually, all those experiences accumulate somewhere. I don't think we're taught enough about emotional recovery in medicine, or how to actually unwind, how to process those thoughts, those stresses that are going on in your background and actually causing damage. Recovery might look like talking honestly to somebody you trust, whether it's a family member, a friend. It might look like writing things down. It might look like giving yourself permission to admit that something is affecting you, because pretending you're unaffected doesn't make you resilient. It usually just makes you disconnected from your job. The fourth question is one I wish I'd started asking much earlier. Who have I actually spent time with recently? Not professionally, but personally. Who knows you outside of medicine? Who reminds you that you're more than just your job? Who's someone that you can have fun with, relax with, do something that's just fun? Because one of the strongest protective factors against burnout isn't another supplement, it isn't another productivity system, it's meaningful human connection. Yet ironically, that's often the first thing that ambitious people sacrifice. We tell ourselves we'll catch up with that friend when life gets less busy, when we finish that rotation, but the problem is that medicine rarely becomes less busy, which means those relationships quietly fade unless you're deliberately proactive, intentional, and actually protect them. I generally think some of the healthiest doctors I've met aren't healthier because they know more medicine. They're healthier because they've protected their communities, their strong relationships in people outside of medicine. And then I asked myself one final question, and honestly this might be the most uncomfortable one. If someone took away my job, my title, my identity as being a doctor tomorrow, who would I be as a person? The first time I seriously thought about this question, I didn't like my answer, because at that time I was all consumed by my job. I'd wrapped up my entire identity as being a doctor, that I'd stopped investing in almost everything else. That's one of the reasons the van that I moved into became so important to me. It wasn't about escaping medicine, it was about rediscovering Thomas, myself. Not Dr. Thomas Webb, but just Thomas, the person who loved exploring new things, traveling, doing active things, being outside. And I honestly believe that every doctor needs something that reconnects them with other parts of their identity, other parts that remind themselves that life isn't just about being a doctor. Because the irony is that the doctors I know that perform at the highest level aren't usually the ones who sacrifice everything for medicine. They're the ones who've built a life that continually gives something back to them. Now obviously this is exactly what we work on inside my one-to-one program. If you do feel like what I've talked about resonates with you, if you want personalized help, someone to guide you through a program that focuses on your specific bottlenecks as a doctor to level up, to become a high performer, to rebuild the identity you once knew in yourself, to reprioritize your health and longevity, personally from a doctor's point of view who actually knows you, then you can book a call in the description. So if I could leave my 22-year-old self with one final thought, it would be this. Don't wait until you're burnt out to start caring about your health. Don't wait until your relationships have drifted to start investing in them. Don't wait until you can't remember the last time you genuinely enjoyed your own life before asking whether something needs to change. Because burnout doesn't begin when you finally collapse. It begins much earlier than that, when you slowly start protecting the parts of yourself that makes the work meaningful in the first place. And here's the encouraging part. If you've been watching this video and you're recognizing yourself in what we talked about today, I don't actually think that's bad news. I think that's probably the best thing that you can be doing right now, actually recognizing what's going on. Because if you've been watching this video so far, there's clearly something you think in yourself you want to improve at, you want to focus at, or even just recognizing the early stages in yourself. So yeah, pat yourself in the back for that, because honestly, the doctors I worry about the most and are going to struggle the most in the long term are the ones that don't ever admit to struggling. They are never aware of things going on. They just are constantly reactive. So awareness is the first step. And remember, you can build an extraordinary career without sacrificing your health. You can actually enjoy your job as a doctor. You can stay being a doctor. You don't have to give it up if you're not enjoying it. You can learn to enjoy it by putting yourself first, by putting your health first, by putting your other parts of your identity first. I've seen doctors do it. I've done it myself. And after everything I've learned over the last decade nearly, that's the conversation I wish someone had sat me down to as a 22-year-old self and just prepare me for all of this. So yes, I hope you got some value from the video today. If you're a doctor and this resonated with you, that is all I want from this video. Okay, see you in the next one.